December 23rd, 1814, and the fading winter light cast long shadows across the sitting room of Ashworth House, as Eleanor watched the seamstress make final alterations to the pale blue dress that hung upon the wooden form near the window. The gown was pretty enough, she supposed, though it mattered little what she wore to the Christmas Eve ball at Thornhill Manor tomorrow evening. At 27, Eleanor Ashworth had long since accepted her role in such gatherings, not as a participant in the glittering dance of courtship, but as a silent observer stationed among the widows and chaperones who lined the walls like faded wallpaper. Her fingers traced the silver handle of her oak walking stick, the last gift her father had given her before the fever took him 3 years past, and she felt the familiar ache that accompanied every thought of him. The childhood illness that had left her with a pronounced limp had also left her with something far more damaging in the eyes of society, an imperfection that rendered her invisible to every eligible gentleman who entered a ballroom. The door burst open and Harriet swept in, all golden curls and rose-pink cheeks, her 19 years of unblemished beauty filling the room like sunshine breaking through clouds. "Oh, Eleanor, have you heard?" she exclaimed, clasping her hands together. "Lord Thomas Greville has confirmed his attendance tomorrow evening, and Mamma says he has been asking after me specifically." Eleanor smiled at her younger sister, genuine warmth mixing with the familiar, bittersweet longing that Harriet's presence always stirred within her. "That is wonderful news," she said softly. "You must wear the white silk with the holly embroidery. It brings out the color of your eyes." Harriet twirled before the mirror, already imagining herself in Lord Greville's arms, while Eleanor turned her gaze toward the window where the first snowflakes of winter had begun to fall. The world outside was transforming into something magical, blanketed in white promise, and yet Eleanor felt only the cold seeping through the glass. She rose carefully, her walking stick bearing her weight as she made her way toward the door, intending to retreat to the quiet sanctuary of her room. She had nearly reached the hallway when voices drifted from the adjacent parlor where her mother was receiving afternoon callers. "Poor Eleanor," Lady Beatrice Sinclair was saying, her voice carrying that particular tone of false sympathy that society ladies perfected like an art form. "It is really quite tragic how she hobbles about, is it not? One almost wonders why Mrs. Ashworth bothers bringing her to these events at all. She will never dance, never marry. She is simply taking up space that could be occupied by someone who matters." Eleanor froze, her hand gripping her walking stick until her knuckles turned white. The snow continued to fall outside, gentle and indifferent, as the words carved themselves into her heart like letters etched in ice. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The dining room felt colder than usual that evening. Or perhaps Eleanor simply could not shake the chill that had settled into her bones since Lady Beatrice's words had found their mark. She sat in her customary place at the table, her book of poetry tucked beside her plate like a talisman against the conversation that swirled around her, and she focused on moving food from dish to mouth with mechanical precision while her mother and sister discussed tomorrow's ball with breathless anticipation. "You must wear my pearls, Harriet," Mrs. Caroline Ashworth was saying, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that had long since abandoned her elder daughter. "They will catch the candlelight beautifully, and Lord Greville will not be able to look away." Eleanor watched her mother's hands flutter like anxious birds as she described the guest list, the orchestra that had been engaged, the particular shade of punch that Lady Ravenscroft had reportedly ordered from London. The Ravenscrofts owned Thornhill Manor, of course, though the old Duchess had passed 2 years prior, and the estate had stood quiet ever since her son the Duke had departed for the continent on some scholarly pursuit that society found both eccentric and vaguely scandalous. "But he has returned," her mother continued, lowering her voice as though sharing a secret of tremendous import. "The Duke of Somerton himself will be in attendance tomorrow evening after 5 years abroad, and every mother in the county is positioning her daughter accordingly." Eleanor felt something stir beneath her resignation at this news, though she could not have said whether it was curiosity or merely the reflexive interest one takes in any disruption to established patterns. She thought briefly of feigning illness, of claiming a headache or a chill that would excuse her from attending, and the temptation was so strong she could taste it like bitter medicine on her tongue. But then she looked at Harriet, radiant with nervous excitement, and she remembered that her sister would need someone to watch over her, someone to ensure that Lord Greville's attentions remained honourable, someone to provide the steady presence that their mother's fluttering anxiety could not supply. "I shall wear the green velvet," Eleanor said quietly, speaking for the first time since the meal began, and her mother looked at her with momentary confusion, as though she had forgotten Eleanor would be attending at all. Yes, that will do nicely," Mrs. Ashworth replied absently, already turning back to Harriet with renewed enthusiasm about the positioning of curls and the application of rose water. Eleanor excused herself early, climbing the stairs to her modest bedroom where the fire had burned low and the shadows gathered in familiar corners. She opened her book of poetry and let the words wash over her like cool water, verses about winter and solitude and the quiet beauty of things that bloom unseen. Tomorrow she would sit among the wallflowers and watch her sister dance, and she would endure whatever cruelties Lady Beatrice chose to dispense, because that was what one did when one loved someone more than one feared pain. The snow continued falling outside her window, and Eleanor read until the candle guttered and died. December 24th, 1814. And the afternoon light was already beginning to fade as Eleanor sat before her dressing table, watching in the mirror as the maid arranged her dark hair into a simple coil at the nape of her neck. In the room adjacent, she could hear Harriet's excited chatter, and her mother's voice rising and falling with instructions about posture and the proper angle at which to hold a fan, and Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of being separate from their world, even while occupying the same house. The deep green velvet dress lay across her bed, its modest neckline and long sleeves a stark contrast to the daringly cut white silk that Harriet would wear, embroidered with delicate holly leaves that had taken a seamstress 3 weeks to complete. Eleanor reached for the small gold locket that rested in its worn leather rim, opening it to gaze upon the miniature portrait of her father that lay within, his kind eyes and gentle smile preserved forever in paint and memory. She fastened it around her neck and felt its weight against her chest like an anchor, something solid to hold on to when the evening's inevitable cruelties began. Her book of poetry was already tucked into her reticule, a secret comfort that would sustain her through the long hours of watching others dance while she sat motionless among the matrons and the forgotten. The maid finished her work and stepped back, and Eleanor was left alone with her reflection, a woman of 27 years, with unremarkable brown eyes and features that might have been called pleasant if anyone had bothered to look closely enough to form an opinion. She studied herself with the detachment of long practice, noting the way her green dress brought some color to her pale cheeks, the way the locket caught the candlelight, the way her expression had settled into something that resembled peace, but was truly only resignation. Somewhere deep within her chest, buried beneath years of careful suppression, there stirred a longing so fierce it frightened her, a desperate wish to be seen, to be wanted, to be asked to dance by someone who meant it. She pressed her palm flat against her heart as if to quiet the treacherous feeling, and reminded herself sternly that such wishes were not for women like her. The carriage would arrive in 2 hours, and outside the window the snow had accumulated into drifts of pristine white that transformed the familiar landscape into something from a fairy story. Eleanor rose carefully, reaching for her walking stick, and made her way to the door where she paused for one final glance at the mirror. Tonight she would sit in her designated corner and watch Harriet shine, and she would smile and nod and pretend that her heart was not breaking with every waltz she could not join. She would be invisible, as she always was, and perhaps that was for the best. The woman in the mirror looked back at her with something like understanding, and Eleanor turned away before the tears she refused to shed could betray her careful composure. The carriage wheels crunched through 6 inches of fresh snow as they approached Thornhill Manor, and Eleanor pressed her gloved hand against the frosted window to catch her first glimpse of the great house rising from the white landscape like something from a dream. Hundreds of candles blazed in every window, their golden light spilling out onto the snow and transforming the grounds into a glittering wonderland, and even Eleanor's carefully guarded heart could not help but stir at the sight. Harriet gasped with delight beside her, clutching their mother's arm and exclaiming about the grandeur of it all, while Mrs. Ashworth murmured prayers of gratitude that her youngest daughter would have such a stage upon which to shine. Eleanor said nothing, only gripped her walking stick more tightly and steeled herself for the evening ahead. The manor itself was a magnificent structure of honey-colored stone, its classical columns and tall windows speaking of old money and older traditions, and as their carriage joined the queue of vehicles depositing guests at the front entrance, Eleanor could hear the faint strains of music drifting through the cold night air. They entered through doors thrown wide in welcome, and immediately Eleanor was enveloped by warmth and sound and the heady scent of evergreen boughs that had been draped across every mantelpiece and wound around every banister. The great hall stretched before them, its ceiling soaring upward into shadows where crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls of light, and garlands of holly and ivy traced intricate patterns along the walls, while hundreds of beeswax candles filled the air with their sweet perfume. Eleanor allowed herself one moment of wonder before the familiar weight of self-consciousness settled upon her shoulders, and she began to scan the room for the quiet corner where she would spend her evening. The orchestra played from a gallery above, their music floating down like snow itself, and already couples were taking their positions for the first dance, while others clustered in groups to exchange gossip and observe the latest fashions. Eleanor spotted Lady Beatrice Sinclair holding court near the refreshment table, her red silk gown catching the candlelight as she leaned close to whisper something to her companions, and Eleanor deliberately turned away before their eyes could meet. She found her place among the wallflowers near a set of tall windows that overlooked the snow-covered gardens, settling into a gilt chair that seemed designed more for decoration than comfort, and arranged her green velvet skirts around her with the practiced movements of someone who had performed this ritual countless times before. From here she could watch Harriet being led onto the floor by Lord Greville, could see her mother beaming with barely contained hope, could observe the swirl of silk and satin as the dance began in earnest. The whispers reached her almost immediately, fragments of conversation that seemed to fill every corner of the room, and the name on everyone's lips was the same. "The Duke has returned," they murmured. "Somerton is here tonight." And Eleanor felt a strange flutter of curiosity even as she reached into her reticule to touch the familiar spine of her book. The first hour of the ball passed as Eleanor had known it would, with her seated among the widows and the wallflowers, while the rest of the world spun in graceful circles across the polished floor, and she watched Harriet dance with Lord Greville for the second time that evening, noting the way her sister's white gown caught the candlelight, and the way Lord Greville's hand rested perhaps a moment too long at her waist. The bittersweet ache in Eleanor's chest had become so familiar that she hardly noticed it anymore, this peculiar mixture of genuine happiness for her sister and a longing so deep it seemed to have no bottom, and she reached into her reticule to touch the spine of her poetry book like a talisman against despair. It was then that Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the music, carrying with that particular clarity that suggested the speaker knew exactly how far her words would travel, and Eleanor heard her own name spoken like something distasteful. "Poor Eleanor Ashworth," Lady Beatrice was saying to her companions, "dragged along like an old piece of furniture that one cannot quite bring oneself to discard. And really, what is the point of bringing her when she only sits there like a lame bird watching the others fly?" The laughter that followed was soft and cruel, and Eleanor felt her cheeks burn even as she kept her expression carefully neutral, her fingers tightening around the book in her lap until her knuckles turned white beneath her gloves. She should leave, she thought wildly, should claim a headache and retreat to the carriage where no one could see her shame. But something stubborn in her refused to give Lady Beatrice the satisfaction of witnessing her flight. Instead, she lifted her chin and turned her gaze toward the tall windows where frost had begun to trace delicate patterns on the glass. And it was in that moment of quiet defiance that she first saw him. He stood near the great fireplace at the far end of the hall, a tall figure in a dark blue coat that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. And even from this distance, Eleanor could see that he was not watching the dancers like everyone else. His attention was fixed upon something else entirely, and when Eleanor followed his line of sight, she realized with a start that he appeared to be looking directly at her. She told herself it was impossible, that a man of such obvious distinction would have no reason to notice a spinster sitting among the forgotten, and yet when she risked another glance, he had not looked away. His face was striking rather than handsome, with strong features and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and upon his hand she could see the glint of a heavy signet ring that marked him as someone of considerable importance. The whispers around her shifted, and Eleanor caught fragments of conversation that made her heart beat strangely faster. "The Duke of Somerton," someone murmured, returned at last after 5 years abroad, and Eleanor looked again at the man by the fireplace, only to find that he was now speaking with his host, while his gaze, impossibly, still seemed to drift toward the window, where she sat alone with her book and her wounded pride. The clock had struck 9, and still Eleanor sat in her chair by the frost-painted window, her book now open in her hands, though her eyes had long ceased to follow the familiar verses, and she found herself retreating further into that quiet place within herself where the whispers and the laughter could not reach her quite so sharply. She had watched Harriet dance with Lord Greville 3 more times, had observed her mother's face glowing with barely contained triumph, had noted the way Lady Beatrice's eyes kept sliding toward her corner with that particular expression of malicious amusement that Eleanor had come to know so well over the years. The ball was in full swing now, the music swelling from the gallery above as couples twirled and dipped in patterns that Eleanor had once memorized from watching through doorways, and she told herself that she was content to sit here with her poetry and her solitude while the rest of the world celebrated Christmas Eve in all its glittering splendor. It was a lie, of course, but it was a comfortable lie, one she had wrapped around herself like a worn blanket against the cold. She did not notice at first when the whispers near her began to change in character, shifting from the usual gossip about gowns and romantic prospects to something more speculative and wondering, and it was only when she heard the words unconventional and refuses to follow expectations that she looked up from her book to discover the source of this new fascination. The Duke of Somerton was moving through the crowd with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested a man who knew exactly where he was going, and to Eleanor's mounting confusion, that destination appeared to be the forgotten corner where she sat among the wallflowers. She watched him approach with growing disbelief, certain that he must be heading toward someone else, perhaps one of the widows seated nearby, or a guest she had not noticed standing behind her. But when he stopped directly before her chair and inclined his head in greeting, there could be no mistaking his intention. His eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch strangely in her chest, and she saw now that they were a deep grey, like winter storms gathering over the moors, and they held none of the pity or condescension she had learned to expect from those who bothered to acknowledge her existence at all. The waltz that had been playing faded into silence as the orchestra prepared for the next piece, and in that suspended moment, Eleanor became acutely aware of how visible she suddenly was, how the guests nearby had stopped their conversations to stare at this most unexpected tableau. "Miss Ashworth," the Duke said, and his voice was lower than she had imagined it would be, warm and deliberate in a way that suggested he chose his words with care. "I wonder if you might do me the honor of this next dance." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her book, her heart pounding against her ribs, and she felt the familiar weight of her walking stick pressed against her leg as she searched his face for any sign of mockery or cruel amusement, and found instead only patient, genuine interest that left her utterly at a loss for words. The silence that stretched between them felt like a living thing, fragile and trembling with possibility, and Eleanor found herself searching for words that would not come while the Duke of Somerton stood before her with that patient, waiting expression that suggested he had all the time in the world for her answer. She could feel the weight of watching eyes upon them now, could sense the way conversations had stilled and fans had ceased their fluttering as society turned its collective attention toward this most unexpected tableau, and the awareness of their scrutiny made her spine stiffen with something that felt almost like defiance. "Your Grace," she said finally, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected. "You do me great honor, but I fear you have chosen your partner poorly, for I do not dance." The words hung in the air between them, blunt and unadorned, and she watched his face for the flicker of confusion or the dawning understanding that would send him retreating back to the bright and beautiful world where he belonged. But instead she saw only a slight tilting of his head, as though her refusal had intrigued rather than deterred him. The music had started again, a gentle country dance that set the other couples spinning across the floor, and still he did not move from his position before her chair. "Forgive my presumption, Miss Ashworth," he said, "but when you say you do not dance, do you mean that you choose not to, or that you cannot?" Eleanor felt her cheeks flush at the directness of his question, at the way he refused to accept polite evasions and social fictions, and she found herself answering with equal honesty before she could think better of it. "I cannot, Your Grace," she said, and her hand moved unconsciously toward her walking stick resting against the arm of her chair. "A childhood illness left me with a weakness in my leg that makes such activities impossible." She braced herself for the pity that would surely follow, for the awkward condolences and the hasty retreat that she had witnessed so many times before when others learned of her limitation. But the Duke's expression did not change, except perhaps to grow more interested, more intent. Lady Beatrice, watching from across the room in her red silk gown, wore an expression of such profound shock that Eleanor might have found it amusing under other circumstances, and somewhere beyond the Duke's shoulder she could see her mother's face frozen in bewildered confusion as she tried to make sense of what she was witnessing. "Then perhaps," the Duke said slowly, "you might permit me to sit with you instead, for I find myself quite weary of dancing and far more interested in discovering what book you have been reading with such absorption that you barely noticed the festivities around you." Eleanor looked down at the volume still clutched in her hands, at the gilt lettering on its spine that spelled out winter verses and other poems, and when she looked up again, she found that Frederick Ravenscroft had already claimed the empty chair beside her, settling into it as though he had every right to abandon his duties as host in favor of conversation with a spinster in a forgotten corner. And for the first time that evening, Eleanor felt something other than resignation stir within her chest. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 9:30, its deep tones resonating through the ballroom and marking the passage of time that Eleanor had somehow lost track of entirely. For she could not quite believe that she had spent the better part of an hour in conversation with the Duke of Somerton, and that he showed no signs of wishing to be anywhere else. They had begun with the book of winter poems still open in her lap, and Frederick had asked her which verse she favoured most, and when she had recited a few lines about snow falling on silent fields, he had smiled in a way that transformed his rather stern features into something approaching warmth, and told her that he had read the same collection while travelling through the Alps 3 years past. He spoke of his time abroad with an enthusiasm that surprised her, describing not the grand tours and social conquests that young men of his station typically boasted of, but instead the libraries he had visited in Vienna, and the manuscripts he had studied in Florence, and the months he had spent in a small Italian monastery, translating texts that had not been read in centuries. Eleanor found herself leaning forward in her chair, her walking stick forgotten, her awareness of the watching crowd fading to a distant murmur as she listened to him describe a world she had only ever imagined through the pages of books. "You would appreciate the library here at Thornhill," he said, and there was something almost shy in the way he offered this, as though he were extending an invitation to something more precious than a mere collection of volumes. "My father spent his life building it, and I have continued his work, and there are now more than 3,000 books waiting to be explored by someone who would truly value them." Eleanor could feel Harriet's curious gaze upon her from the dance floor, where she still moved through the figures with Lord Greville, could sense the whispers growing louder among the guests who could not understand why the Duke of Somerton had abandoned his duties to sit with the crippled spinster in the corner, but for once she found that she did not care what they thought or said. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," Frederick said, and his grey eyes held hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken in a way she had never experienced. "If you could have anything at all from this evening, if there were no limitations and no watching eyes and no expectations to constrain you, what would you wish for?" The question caught her off guard with its directness, with its genuine desire to understand her heart rather than make polite conversation, and before she could stop herself, she heard her own voice speaking a truth she had never admitted to anyone. "I would wish to dance," she said softly, and the words felt like a confession drawn from the deepest part of her soul, just once, without everyone staring at me, without wondering what they are thinking or knowing that they pity me or find me amusing. I would wish to know what it feels like to move to music without shame. Frederick's expression changed in a way she could not quite interpret, something flickering behind his eyes that looked almost like determination, and he nodded slowly, as though she had just told him something of profound importance that he intended to remember. The clock had not yet finished its final resonant chime when a footman appeared in the doorway of the ballroom, his voice carrying across the candle-lit space with the announcement that supper was now being served in the adjacent dining hall, and Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest as she watched the guests begin to stir from their conversations and drift toward the promise of food and wine and continued gossip. She knew what would happen now, knew it with the certainty of someone who had attended dozens of such events, and understood precisely how the evening would unfold, for the Duke of Somerton would be required to lead the procession into supper, would be expected to sit at the head of the table and make polite conversation with the most distinguished guests, and their strange interlude would fade into memory like morning frost beneath the sun. Frederick had risen from his chair beside her, and she prepared herself for the gracious farewell, for the polite words that would signal the end of whatever magic had briefly touched her life. But instead of offering his arm to some worthy dowager or titled lady, he turned to look at her with an expression she could not quite decipher. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was low enough that only she could hear him above the rustle of silk and the murmur of voices moving toward the supper room. "I must ask something of you that may seem strange, and I hope you will trust me enough to grant it." Eleanor felt her heart quicken in her chest, felt the familiar flutter of hope that she had spent so many years learning to suppress, and she nodded without knowing what she was agreeing to, because something in his grey eyes told her that this moment mattered more than she could understand. "Stay here," he said. "Do not move from this spot, and wait for me." And before she could ask what he meant, or why he was making such an unusual request, he had turned and walked away toward the supper room, his tall figure disappearing through the doorway, along with the last trailing guests, until Eleanor found herself alone in the vast ballroom, with only the orchestra remaining in their gallery above and the candles burning lower in their crystal chandeliers. She sat in her chair by the tall, frost-traced windows and watched the snow falling beyond the glass, watched the way the flakes caught the light from within and seemed to glow like tiny stars descending from heaven. And she told herself that she was foolish to wait, foolish to hope, foolish to believe that a duke would return to a spinster with a limp when the whole glittering world of society waited for him in the next room. The minutes stretched like hours as the sounds of distant conversation and clinking glasses filtered through the closed doors, and Eleanor's hand found its way to the gold locket at her throat, to the small portrait of her father that she carried always against her heart, and she wondered what he would say if he could see her now, alone in an empty ballroom, waiting for something that could not possibly come true. The great doors of the ballroom had been closed now, she noticed, the tall carved panels fitted together so precisely that not even a sliver of light from the corridor beyond could penetrate the seal, and Eleanor wondered if she had simply been forgotten here in this vast, glittering space while the rest of the world moved on to supper and conversation and all the ordinary pleasures of a Christmas Eve celebration. The 8 musicians in the gallery above had not departed with the other guests, she realized, and this struck her as strange, for surely they too would wish to take their refreshment, yet they remained at their posts with instruments ready as though awaiting some signal she could not perceive. The candles had burned lower in the hours since the ball began, their flames casting longer shadows across the polished floor, where so many couples had danced while she sat watching from her chair by the frost-traced windows, and the snow beyond the glass was falling more heavily now. Great white flakes descending through the darkness like feathers shaken from some celestial pillow. She should leave, she told herself, should take up her walking stick, and make her way to the supper room where her mother and Harriet would be wondering what had become of her, should accept that whatever strange interlude had passed between herself and the Duke of Somerton had been nothing more than a gentleman's kindness to an awkward spinster, and yet she found that she could not bring herself to move from the spot where he had asked her to wait. The sound of footsteps reached her ears then, measured and deliberate, coming not from the direction of the supper room, but from somewhere deeper within the manor. And when she turned her head, she saw Frederick emerging from a side door she had not noticed before. His dark blue coat immaculate, and his grey eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He walked toward her across the empty expanse of the ballroom floor, and as he drew closer she became aware of subtle movements around the edges of the room, footmen in Ravenscroft livery quietly closing the remaining doors, drawing heavy velvet curtains across the windows until only the candlelight remained to illuminate the space, and she understood then that something extraordinary was happening, though she could not quite believe the evidence of her own senses. "Miss Ashworth," Frederick said when he stood before her once more, and his voice was gentle but carried clearly through the sudden hush that had fallen over the room, "I have done something rather unconventional, and I hope you will forgive me for it." He gestured to the empty ballroom around them, to the closed doors and the waiting orchestra, and the soft glow of 100 candles reflected in the polished floor. And when he spoke again, His words were the most astonishing she had ever heard in all her 27 years of quiet, invisible existence. "I have cleared the room for you," he said simply, "so that you might dance without a single eye upon you save mine." Eleanor could not speak, could not breathe, could not do anything but stare at this man who had done the impossible, who had taken her whispered confession about wishing she could dance without being watched and transformed it into reality with the casual authority of a duke who understood that power meant nothing if it could not be used to create moments of grace for those who had been denied them. The tears she had fought against all evening rose unbidden to her eyes, and she pressed her fingers to her lips as though she could hold back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. But Frederick simply stood before her with patience written across his features, making no move to rush her, offering no false comfort, simply waiting for her to find her way through the storm of feeling that his gesture had unleashed. "Why?" she finally managed to whisper, and her voice was rough with the tears she could not quite contain. "Why would you do this for me?" And she heard in her own words all the years of invisibility, all the nights spent watching others dance while she sat forgotten among the chaperones, all the cruel whispers and pitying glances that had taught her to expect nothing from the world but the quiet dignity of endurance. Frederick stepped closer then, and she watched as he drew off his gloves with deliberate care, tucking them into the pocket of his dark blue coat. And when he spoke, his voice was low and certain in a way that made her heart ache with something she was afraid to name. "Because I have spent the last hour watching you, Miss Ashworth," he said, "and I have seen something that I suspect very few people have bothered to look for." And the way he spoke made it clear that he was not offering flattery or pity, but something far more valuable, the simple truth of genuine recognition. "I saw you sitting by these windows with your book of winter poems," he continued, "and I saw the way you lifted your chin when Lady Beatrice made her cruel remarks, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing you wounded, and I saw intelligence and grace and a dignity that puts half the preening peacocks in that supper-room to shame." Eleanor felt something crack open inside her chest, some wall she had built over years of disappointment and resignation, and she understood that this man saw her, truly saw her, not as the spinster with the limp or the unfortunate elder Ashworth sister, but as Eleanor, a woman with thoughts and feelings and a heart that had never stopped longing for exactly this, to be noticed, to be valued, to be offered something more than the pitying tolerance of a society that had written her off years ago. The orchestra above began to play a waltz, soft and slow and achingly beautiful, and Frederick extended his bare hand toward her, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel as though she were the only woman in the entire world. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was tender now, "will you honor me with this dance? Here where no one can see us, here where the only eyes upon you are mine, and I promise you they see nothing but beauty." She placed her hand in his, and the warmth of his bare palm against her fingers sent a tremor through her entire body, a sensation so foreign, after years of careful distance, that she almost pulled away from the intensity of it. But Frederick's grip was gentle and sure as he drew her toward the center of the empty ballroom floor, where the candlelight pooled like liquid gold upon the polished wood. His other hand came to rest at her waist, the pressure of his fingers light against the deep green velvet of her gown, and Eleanor found herself looking up into grey eyes that held no trace of the pity she had learned to expect, only a quiet joy that seemed to mirror the unfamiliar feeling blooming in her own chest. The orchestra above began the waltz in earnest now, the melody slower than the dances she had watched all evening, as though the musicians understood instinctively that this moment required a different tempo, a gentler rhythm that would allow two people to find their way to each other without haste. She took her first step and felt the familiar hitch in her movement, the weakness in her left leg that had defined her existence for so many years. But Frederick moved with her as though he had anticipated exactly how her body would respond, adjusting his own stride so seamlessly that she barely noticed the accommodation. They turned together beneath the soft glow of 100 candles, and Eleanor realized with something approaching wonder that she was dancing, truly dancing, not the careful shuffling she had sometimes attempted in the privacy of her own chamber, but an actual waltz with a partner who held her as though she were precious. The snow continued to fall beyond the tall windows, visible now only as a pale shimmer against the darkness beyond the glass, and she thought that she had never seen anything so beautiful as this moment, this impossible gift that Frederick had created for her out of nothing but observation and kindness, and a willingness to defy every convention that governed their world. Her gown whispered against the floor as they moved, the velvet catching the light and releasing it again with each turn, and she became aware that her walking stick stood forgotten against the chair by the window where she had left it, unnecessary now in the circle of Frederick's arms. He was watching her face with an expression she could not quite name, something between tenderness and triumph, and when he spoke his voice was low enough that only she could hear it above the sweet strains of the waltz. "You dance beautifully, Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was no condescension in his tone, no surprise that she could manage even this simple pleasure, only the honest appreciation of a man who saw what others had refused to see. Eleanor felt something shift inside her then, some final resistance crumbling away, and she allowed herself to smile, truly smile, for the first time in longer than she could remember. The clock in the corner showed 10:30, and midnight approached with all its promise of Christmas and new beginnings and the extraordinary possibility that she might deserve happiness after all. The music faded slowly, the final notes of the waltz dissolving into the candle-lit silence like snowflakes melting upon warm skin, and Eleanor found herself standing in the circle of Frederick's arms with her heart beating so loudly she was certain he must hear it echoing off the empty walls of the great ballroom. Neither of them moved for a long moment, and she became aware that his hand still rested at her waist, that her fingers still lay curled within his palm, that they stood closer now than propriety would ever permit if there had been witnesses to observe them. The clock in the corner showed midnight, and she knew with a certainty that settled into her bones like winter cold that this evening had changed the entire trajectory of her existence, had rewritten every assumption she had carried about her place in the world and her chances for happiness. Frederick released her slowly, almost reluctantly, and stepped back just enough to look into her face with those grey eyes that seemed to see everything she had spent years hiding from the world. "Miss Ashworth," he said, and his voice was rough with something she dared not name. "I find myself unwilling to let this evening end without securing the promise of another meeting." And the formality of his words was softened by the way he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, a gesture so tender that she felt tears threaten again at the corners of her eyes. She heard distant sounds now, the murmur of voices and the scrape of chairs that indicated supper was concluding, that the guests would soon return to find the ballroom they had left empty, now occupied by a duke and a spinster standing far too close together in the amber glow of dying candles. "May I call upon you tomorrow?" he asked. And there was a vulnerability in his question that startled her, as though this man who commanded rooms with his presence and cleared ballrooms with a word was genuinely uncertain whether she would grant him this small request. "It is Christmas Day tomorrow," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she had expected, and her mother would think it most irregular for a duke to come calling on a holiday morning when they had only just met. "Then let her think me irregular," Frederick replied, and a smile curved his lips in a way that made her heart stutter in her chest, for I have spent 5 years abroad cultivating a reputation for eccentricity, and I should hate to disappoint anyone by suddenly becoming conventional now. The doors at the far end of the ballroom began to open, and Eleanor heard the swell of voices as guests filtered back toward the dancing, their conversations dying into shocked whispers as they took in the sight of the Duke of Somerton standing alone with Eleanor Ashworth in the middle of an otherwise empty floor. "Yes," Eleanor said quickly, before her courage could fail her, before the weight of watching eyes could crush the fragile hope that had bloomed in her chest over the past hours. "Yes, you may call tomorrow." And she watched his smile widen into something that looked remarkably like joy. Harriet appeared at the edge of Eleanor's vision, her white gown catching the candlelight as she stared at her elder sister with an expression of pure astonishment. And Eleanor realized that everything had changed, that she would never again be simply the invisible spinster sitting among the chaperones, that Frederick Ravenscroft had seen her, and in seeing her, had made her visible to the world at last. Eleanor woke to pale winter light filtering through frost-etched windows and the muffled silence that only fresh snow could bring, and for one disorienting moment she lay perfectly still beneath her covers, uncertain whether the events of the previous evening had been real or merely the most vivid dream her lonely heart had ever conjured to torment her. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as though she might find some physical evidence of the hours she had spent in Frederick's company, some proof that a duke had truly cleared a ballroom for her, had held her in his arms as they waltzed alone beneath candlelight, while snow fell beyond the tall windows of Thornhill Manor. The gold locket containing her father's portrait lay cool against her collarbone, and she touched it now as she had touched it 1,000 times before when she needed courage, when she needed to remember that someone had once looked at her with love and seen something worth cherishing. The clock on her mantel showed 8:30, and she could hear movement elsewhere in Ashworth House, the sounds of servants preparing Christmas breakfast, the distant murmur of her mother's voice giving instructions about the day's arrangements. Eleanor rose slowly, her left leg stiff from the dancing she had done after years of sitting on the sidelines, and crossed to her window, where she pushed aside the curtain to reveal a world transformed by 6 inches of pristine white snow that covered the garden and the lane beyond, the tracks of some early morning creature, the only marks upon its perfect surface. She dressed carefully in a simple morning gown, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons, and made her way downstairs to find her mother and Harriet already seated at the breakfast table with plates of eggs and toast before them, their conversation dying into curious silence as Eleanor appeared in the doorway. Her mother's eyes held a strange new calculating quality as she studied her elder daughter, as though seeing her for the first time in years, while Harriet simply smiled with an expression of genuine warmth that made Eleanor's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. "I did not dream it then," Eleanor said quietly as she took her seat, and Harriet reached across the table to squeeze her hand in a gesture of sisterly solidarity that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "He watched you all evening," Harriet said, her voice low enough that their mother could not hear from her position at the head of the table. "I saw him standing by the fireplace, and his eyes never left you, not even when Lady Beatrice tried to catch his attention, and I thought surely I must be mistaken. But I was not, Eleanor, I was not mistaken at all." Before Eleanor could respond, before she could give voice to the hope and terror warring in her chest, the sound of carriage wheels crunching through snow reached them through the windows, and a footman appeared in the doorway with an expression of barely concealed astonishment. "The Duke of Somerton's carriage," he announced, approaching the house, and Eleanor felt her heart stop in her chest before resuming its rhythm at twice its normal pace, because Frederick had promised to call, and Frederick had kept his word. Eleanor rose from her chair so quickly that she nearly upset her teacup, and her mother was already adjusting her cap and smoothing her morning dress with the air of a woman who had never in her life expected a duke to come calling at Ashworth House on Christmas morning, let alone a duke who had spent the previous evening dancing with her elder daughter while the rest of society watched in stunned disbelief. The footman barely had time to announce him properly before Frederick swept into the sitting room, with snow still dusting the shoulders of his greatcoat, and his grey eyes finding Eleanor's face immediately, as though she were the only person in the room worth seeing, as though her mother and Harriet had faded into mere shadows against the wallpaper. "Your Grace?" Mrs. Ashworth began, her voice pitched higher than usual with nervous excitement. "What an unexpected honour on this Christmas morning!" And Frederick turned to her with perfect courtesy, even as his gaze kept drifting back to Eleanor, who stood frozen beside her chair with her heart pounding beneath the gold locket at her throat. "I hope you will forgive the informality of calling so early," he said, "but I found myself unable to wait any longer to fulfill the promise I made last evening," and he held out a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a green ribbon that matched the colour of the dress Eleanor had worn to the ball. She took it with trembling fingers, aware of her mother's sharp intake of breath and Harriet's encouraging smile, and when she pulled away the wrapping, she found herself holding a book bound in burgundy leather with gilt lettering on the spine, a rare first edition of the same collection of winter poems they had discussed the night before, the very book she had been reading when he first approached her by the window. "I searched my library this morning," Frederick said quietly. And his voice was meant for her alone, despite the audience watching their every exchange, "and I remembered that you said your copy was borrowed and must be returned, and I thought perhaps you might like one of your own to keep." Eleanor pressed the book against her chest, as though it were something infinitely precious, and she felt the tears threatening again, because he had listened. He had remembered. He had gone to the trouble of finding this gift for her on Christmas morning, when he could have been doing anything else in the world. "I have also come to extend an invitation," Frederick continued, turning now to include Mrs. Ashworth and Harriet in his address. "I am hosting a New Year's Eve celebration at Thornhill Manor, and I would be honoured if your family would attend as my special guests." Her mother accepted with an enthusiasm that bordered on unseemly. But Eleanor barely heard the words, because Frederick was looking at her again with that expression of tender intent. And then he asked if Miss Ashworth might show him the garden despite the snow, and somehow they found themselves standing together among the frozen evergreen hedges with their breath making clouds in the cold air. And Frederick took her gloved hand in his and said simply, "I meant every word I spoke last night." And Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps this was not a dream after all. The week that followed Christmas Day passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing certainty, each day bringing Frederick to Ashworth House with some new excuse to see Eleanor, whether to bring her another book from his collection or to walk with her through the snow-covered lanes near her home, or simply to sit beside her in the parlour, while her mother pretended not to watch their every interaction with barely concealed delight. Eleanor felt herself changing with each visit, felt the walls she had built around her heart crumbling brick by brick, as Frederick continued to look at her, with that expression of genuine admiration that she was finally beginning to trust. And by the time New Year's Eve arrived, and the Ashworth family carriage rolled up the long drive to Thornhill Manor for the second time in a week, she found that the nervous dread she had carried to the Christmas ball had transformed into something closer to eager anticipation. The manor glittered with candlelight as they entered, the great hall filled with guests who turned to watch Eleanor's arrival with expressions far different from the dismissive glances she had endured her entire life. And she realized with a start that society had already begun to accept what she herself was only now coming to believe, that the Duke of Somerton had chosen her, and that his choice had elevated her in ways she had never imagined possible. Frederick appeared at her side within moments of her arrival, his grey eyes warm with welcome, as he took her gloved hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that made her mother gasp audibly and Lady Beatrice Sinclair turn an interesting shade of purple across the room. "I have something to show you," he murmured near her ear, and Eleanor allowed him to lead her away from the crowded hall and down a corridor she had not seen before. Their footsteps echoing on polished marble until they reached a set of heavy oak doors that he pushed open to reveal the library he had mentioned on that first magical evening. Eleanor stepped inside and felt her breath catch in her throat, for the room stretched before her in magnificent splendor. 3,000 volumes lining walls that rose 2 stories high, a rolling ladder attached to brass rails, leather armchairs positioned before a fireplace, where flames crackled and danced, casting golden light across Persian carpets and mahogany tables scattered with maps and manuscripts. "This is where I spent most of my years abroad," Frederick said softly as he closed the door behind them. "Corresponding with scholars and collectors, building this library book by book, and I used to imagine sharing it with someone who would understand its value, someone who would see these volumes not as mere decoration, but as doorways to other worlds." Eleanor moved through the space as though in a dream, her fingers trailing along leather spines, reading titles in Latin and Greek and French, recognizing treatises on philosophy and history and natural science alongside the poetry collections she loved so dearly. And when she turned back to Frederick, she found him watching her with an expression that made her heart pound against her ribs. "I wanted you to see this," he said, stepping closer until only inches separated them, "because I wanted you to see your future." And the clock on the mantel showed 20 minutes until midnight, as Eleanor finally understood what this evening would bring. The firelight cast dancing shadows across Frederick's face as he turned to Eleanor with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat, and she saw in his grey eyes something that looked very much like reverence as he reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that gleamed dark blue in the flickering light. "Eleanor," he began, and his voice was lower than she had ever heard it, roughened by emotion that he made no attempt to conceal. "I have spent the past week trying to find the words to tell you what you have come to mean to me, but every phrase I compose feels inadequate to the truth of what I feel when I am in your presence." She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up one hand gently, asking with that simple gesture for permission to continue, and she nodded because she could not have formed words even if she had known what to say. "I know what society has told you about yourself," he said, stepping closer until she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes like tiny flames. "I know they have called you a spinster and whispered about your limp and dismissed you as though you were somehow less worthy of love because you do not fit their narrow definition of desirability." His voice grew fiercer now, passionate in a way that made her heart pound against her ribs. "They are fools, Eleanor. Blind fools who cannot see that true beauty lies not in perfect features or graceful dancing, but in the courage to maintain one's dignity in the face of cruelty, in the intelligence that shines from your eyes when you speak of poetry, in the quiet strength that allows you to endure their mockery without becoming bitter or cruel yourself." He opened the velvet box to reveal a ring that stole her breath, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds that caught the firelight and scattered it into 1,000 tiny stars. "This ring belonged to my grandmother," he said softly, "a woman who was told she would never marry because she spoke her mind too freely and cared more for books than ballrooms. And she wore it for 50 years as the Duchess of Somerton while proving every doubter wrong." Eleanor felt the tears sliding down her cheeks now, hot and unstoppable, and she did not try to hide them because Frederick was looking at her as though her tears were precious rather than embarrassing, as though every emotion she felt mattered to him deeply. "I am asking you to wear this ring," he continued, sinking to one knee before her on the Persian carpet, while the fire crackled and the clock on the mantel showed 5 minutes until midnight. "I am asking you to become my wife, my duchess, my partner in all things, and I am asking not despite your differences from other women, but because of them." The poetry book he had given her on Christmas morning sat visible on the table beside them, a tangible reminder of how he had listened, how he had remembered, how he had seen her when no one else would bother to look. "Eleanor Ashworth," Frederick said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "Will you marry me?" The clock on the mantel began to strike midnight, as Eleanor looked down at Frederick kneeling before her, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight and holding an expression of such open vulnerability that she felt her last defences crumble into dust, and she realized in that moment that she had spent 27 years believing herself unworthy of exactly this, of a man who would kneel before her and offer her not pity but partnership, not charity but genuine love, and she was tired of believing the lies that society had whispered about her since childhood. "Yes," she breathed, and the word emerged stronger than she expected, carrying with it all the hope she had suppressed for so long. "Yes, Frederick, I will marry you." And she watched his face transform with joy as the clock continued its midnight chimes, marking the death of one year and the birth of another, just as this moment marked the death of the woman she had been and the birth of someone new. Someone who dared to believe she deserved happiness. Frederick rose from his knee and took her hands in his, and she could feel them trembling slightly as he slid the sapphire ring onto her finger, the stones catching the firelight and scattering blue and white sparks across the library walls like stars coming down from heaven to witness their promise to each other. "You have made me the happiest man in England," he said, his voice rough with emotion, and Eleanor laughed through her tears because she had never imagined anyone saying such words to her, had resigned herself to a life of watching from the edges while others found love. And now here she stood in a library containing 3,000 books, with a duke who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. The clock finished its 12th chime, and Frederick lifted one hand to cup her face with infinite tenderness, his thumb brushing away the tears that streamed down her cheeks as he leaned closer, and Eleanor felt her heart pounding so fiercely she was certain he must hear it as his lips met hers in a kiss that was gentle at first, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But she did not pull away because she had spent her entire life pulling away from joy, and she was finished with that now. The kiss deepened as she rose onto her toes, despite the ache in her leg, her hands gripping his lapels to steady herself, and she felt his arm wrap around her waist to support her as naturally as he had supported her during their first dance, and when they finally parted they were both breathless and smiling, and the new year had begun. "We should return to the guests," Frederick murmured against her hair, though he made no move to release her. "They will wonder where their host has disappeared to." And Eleanor nodded, but allowed herself one more moment in his arms, one more breath of this happiness that still felt fragile and impossible despite the weight of the ring on her finger. When they finally emerged from the library and walked together toward the great hall, where music and laughter spilled through the doorways, Eleanor saw the guests turn to watch them approach, saw the recognition dawn on face after face as they noticed her tear-stained cheeks and radiant smile and the sapphire glittering on her hand, and for the first time in her life, she did not shrink from their stares, but lifted her chin and met their gazes with quiet pride, walking into her new life beside the man who had cleared an entire ballroom just to see her dance. The weeks that followed their engagement passed in a blur of joy and preparation that Eleanor could scarcely believe was real, and she found herself touching the sapphire ring on her finger dozens of times each day as though to confirm that she had not invented the entire extraordinary turn her life had taken since that Christmas Eve, when a duke had cleared an entire ballroom just to see her dance. The wedding was set for February the 14th, a date Frederick had chosen with a soft smile and a murmured comment about Valentine's Day being appropriate for a love story that had begun with poetry and continued with prose, and Eleanor had laughed and agreed, even as her heart swelled with the knowledge that this man, this remarkable man, wanted the world to know he was marrying her for love, rather than convenience or obligation. Society had adjusted to the news with varying degrees of grace, and Eleanor took quiet satisfaction in watching Lady Beatrice Sinclair struggle to reconcile her previous cruelty with her current need to curry favour with the future Duchess of Somerton, the same woman she had mocked as a limping spinster, now receiving invitations to every fashionable gathering in the county. Eleanor declined most of these invitations, preferring to spend her time at Thornhill Manor with Frederick, wandering through the library he had promised her, or sitting together by the fire while he read aloud from the poetry books they both loved, and she discovered that happiness was not a destination she had been unworthy of reaching, but rather a home she had simply never been shown the door to before. Harriet had accepted Lord Thomas Greville's proposal on Twelfth Night, and the sisters found themselves planning weddings together in a way that Eleanor had never imagined possible, their relationship transformed by the change in Eleanor's circumstances and by Harriet's genuine delight in her elder sister's happiness. Their mother Caroline had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all, suddenly remembering Eleanor's many virtues and speaking of her as though she had always known her eldest daughter was destined for greatness. And while Eleanor recognized the hollowness of this belated appreciation, she chose to accept it with grace rather than bitterness, because she had learned that holding on to old wounds only prevented new joys from taking root. The morning of February the 14th dawned clear and cold, with frost painting delicate patterns on the windows of Ashworth House, as Eleanor prepared to leave her childhood home for the last time as Miss Ashworth, and she stood before the mirror in her wedding gown of ivory silk, and saw not the flaws that society had catalogued for 27 years, but the woman Frederick saw when he looked at her, a woman of dignity and intelligence and quiet strength, who deserved every happiness that was coming to her. Her oak walking stick with its silver handle stood in the corner where it had always stood, a gift from her father that had supported her through years of difficulty, and she picked it up now, not with shame, but with gratitude for the journey it represented, the long road that had led her here to this moment when everything was about to change. The church of St. Michael stood adorned with winter roses and evergreen boughs as Eleanor made her way down the aisle on that Valentine's morning, her oak walking stick with its silver handle keeping rhythm with the organ music that swelled through the ancient stone nave, and she felt the eyes of every person in attendance upon her. But for the first time in her life, those eyes held no power to wound her, because at the end of the aisle stood Frederick, her Frederick, watching her approach with an expression of such profound love and wonder that she felt tears prick at her eyes, even as a smile spread across her face. The ceremony passed in a blur of sacred words and solemn vows, and when Frederick slipped the gold band onto her finger beside the sapphire engagement ring, Eleanor heard her own voice steady and strong as she promised to love and cherish him for all the days of her life, a promise she made not out of duty or gratitude, but out of genuine love for the man who had seen her when no one else bothered to look. They emerged from the church into bright February sunshine that made the frost sparkle like scattered diamonds. And the villagers who had gathered to witness the new Duchess of Somerton cheered as Frederick handed her into the carriage that would carry them to Thornhill Manor for the wedding breakfast, and Eleanor laughed with pure joy as he climbed in beside her and pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple, while the carriage wheels crunched over frozen ground. The wedding breakfast was everything elegant and warm, with fires blazing in every hearth and champagne flowing freely, and Eleanor sat beside her husband at the head of the long table and marvelled at how completely her life had changed in the space of 8 weeks, how the woman who had resigned herself to spinsterhood now wore a duchess's coronet and the love of a good man like a mantle of light around her shoulders. When the last guests had departed and the servants had retired, Frederick led Eleanor through the quiet corridors of Thornhill to the library where he had proposed, and they stood together before the fire that crackled in the hearth, husband and wife at last. "I have one more gift for you," Frederick said softly, and he crossed to the desk where a leather-bound volume lay waiting, and when he placed it in her hands, Eleanor saw that it was her own book of winter poems, the same one she had been reading on the night they met. But now its flyleaf bore an inscription in Frederick's flowing hand, "To my Eleanor, who taught me that the most beautiful things are often found in quiet corners, overlooked by those too foolish to truly see." She wept then, happy tears that Frederick kissed away one by one, and as the fire burned low and the winter stars wheeled overhead through the library windows, Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home, not in this grand manor with its 3,000 books and its ancient name, but in the arms of the man who had cleared an entire ballroom just to see her dance,